Okay, hey everybody. Welcome to today's gathering. It's always a delight to be able to see friends, colleagues, and students and friends of the department, and especially to be able to welcome you to this kind of an event where we get to applaud and celebrate our own faculty's achievements. And whether you're a student or a colleague, you've heard me say multiple times how proud I am of our department and particularly our faculty, my friends and colleagues, because they're just such smart people who do incredible work in the classroom as researchers, and publications are just one of the venues within which they demonstrate how amazing and awesome they are. And so what we decided that we would do, maybe 2 years ago or so, that we would actually have a gathering where we get to applaud and celebrate our faculty book publications. And so today I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to hear about 4 faculty publications for this academic year. We'll hear from Michael Borgstrom, we'll hear from Peña, Hal Jaffe, and Yetta Howard. We figured the format for today will be each one we'll have about 10 minutes. They'll talk about their books, and then at the end of the 4 little mini talks, we'll open it up for a question and answer period in which you all can ask the faculty authors questions that you may have. And so, and the chat will be disabled while our speakers are talking, but then it'll be opened up again at the end so that you can, if you prefer to enter your questions in the chat, you may do it that way, or you can just, you can just raise a blue hand or something at the end. But for now, without further ado, I'm so happy I get to present our first speaker, my dear friend and colleague, Michael Borgstrom. So take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Philip. Just so all of you know, I already am getting messages that my connection is unstable. So I asked Philip to text me if I suddenly freeze up. So if you see me looking in lots of different directions, that's why. But I just want to say, first off, thank you so much, Philip, and Jess, thank you, and Kim, thank you for organizing the event. I realize how challenging it is to corral people during an extraordinarily busy time. But I appreciate the opportunity to see folks and to share ideas. And Philip, I can't tell if have I frozen or not. So Philip, you keep moving around if you don't mind, so that I can tell that. Yeah, okay. One of the ways to explain my work for this book is to share one of its backstories, and it actually has quite a few backstories, but this particular one began with a chance conversation that I had with one of my colleagues at a reception for incoming graduate students now about a few years ago. And this colleague and I were just talking about our plans for the upcoming academic year, catching up on our summers, talking about the classes we were going to be teaching, our objectives for research, the work that we'd be doing for service, just basic stuff. But eventually our chit chat kind of morphed into a different kind of conversation about the larger discipline of literary and cultural study. And we started to share our concerns with some of the field's critical attitudes. We both felt a kind of disconnect from a jadedness that seemed to pervade literary study, and a kind of overriding skepticism that could often seem somewhat endemic to the field itself. And we've also both felt that that disposition was abetted by what we kept hearing about in the academy, which was that there was a crisis in the humanities, and that the humanities themselves were basically useless, that they served no real purpose in the world. So this colleague and I were talking about this, and we both sort of admitted to one another that what we wanted to do was to try to push back, if we could, against some of that cynicism. We wanted to reconnect with some of the enthusiasms that brought us to the field in the first place. And we wanted to talk about what we saw as some of the real world value of literary study. To be clear, these were not popular perspectives. They were certainly not cool within the prevailing idioms of the academy. And so both of us realized that we were sort of treading into risky intellectual territory. That conversation, though, was also extremely generative for me. It got me thinking about that sense of disconnection and disjunction that both of us felt. And it started me thinking about why we were so worried to admit to people who were not our friends, why we were so worried about talking about the value of literary study. So that's partly where this book started to emerge, wanting to find an alternative to prevailing forms and especially attitudes of academic critique, and partly to show how literature can change the ways that we perceive and interact with the world around us. So I became really interested in the experiences of readers who were not habituated to literary forms of critique. And I was really interested in how those readers engaged with literature and brought it into their lives. And to me, those sorts of dynamics provided really clear evidence of the value of literature and of the broader value of the humanities. As luck would have it, I have a job in which I witnessed those practices all the time. And so I started to pay very close attention to how my students were reading and how they analyzed works and how they sort of absorbed them and brought them into themselves. And I started to look to them for analytical frameworks that were not structured by cynicism. And eventually I found myself writing a book that centered on those dynamics that I saw sort of percolating up within my classes. So my book is really structured on three interlocking claims. One is that literary study offers important contributions to social knowledge. Two, that those contributions are exemplified by methods that tend to prioritize cultural attachment rather than estrangement or disjunction. And thirdly, it makes the claim that the university classroom itself is a key component of this kind of intellectual work. To many of you, these may not seem like particularly unusual or controversial claims. They might seem, in fact, just to describe some of the basic features of professional literary study. But the current climate in which we have found ourselves over the past several years, including in the university itself, often sort of just dismisses the humanities out of hand and disparages its value. And I think that's why that conversation I had with my colleague seemed so incredibly risky to both of us. I mean, I think it only could have happened because we were already friends. So it became clear to me that I wanted to make a case for the significance of how the humanities requires articulation of its social effects. In other words, not just that the humanities were important, but to demonstrate how they are important and why that matters. And therefore, my book engages materials in ways that are a little bit different from other scholarship that appears in literary studies, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The example I decided to use in order to make those kind of broad claims about significance and value and the ongoing necessity of literary study and of the humanities was centered on contemporary attention that had been being paid for many years to sexual difference. In other words, because queerness now affects everyone and nobody can really ignore it in ways that they might have been able to years ago, I felt as though it marked a shift in our understanding of public culture. And so my book looks at the broad and ongoing response to some of those shifting social realities. A little bit of another backstory. From the moment I arrived at San Diego State, I saw students engaging with precisely these issues. They identified queerness as just a basic fact, a basic feature of life in the United States. And they used literature to help figure out how culture itself might respond to that basic fact. And their interest then in queerness, which came from lots of different angles, offered what I felt were really fresh ways of thinking about how and why literature matters, how it can be repurposed to particular social ends and social effects. So the book that I wrote shows how we reach out to texts for a variety of reasons. Often we go to reading in order to feel something or to listen to other voices. And I think perhaps especially to learn. And I describe those efforts as acts of what I call textual befriending. They're overtures that are based in a kind of fundamental curiosity about the world, and they demonstrate an openness, a receptivity to the possibility of social attachment, which is why befriending happens in the first place. So for me, befriending references a kind of intellectual attitude that impinges upon scholarly method. It reorients some of the skepticism that my colleague and I had been concerned about, the skepticism about the value of literature, toward an appreciation of its cultural power. And that shift in dispositional approach is absolutely the cue that I took from my students over several years. So for that reason, the book is a little bit unusual in the fact that it includes empirical evidence from the classroom in order to support its claims. I weave sort of within its analysis reports on readers' engagement with literary works and their effects. And in that way, the book aims to put into practice what it advocates on a conceptual level. So I sort of wanted to practice what I was preaching in this particular book. Because my own disciplinary field is United States literature of the 19th century, that became my default zone for inquiry. And I was struck over and over again by how students in my classes were engaging early texts in ways that their authors simply could not have imagined. How works by, for instance, Harriet Beecher Stowe, or Nathaniel Hawthorne, or Julia Ward Howe were kind of repurposed for students' interest in contemporary issues about queerness. And so I'm mindful of time. My book demonstrates how readers therefore sort of approach texts in ways that are often startling and unexpected. But it foregrounds how being curious about what these books might contain and what they might offer functions as that form of befriending. And the book documents then how that sort of openness can shift perspective and really sort of open up new understandings. So I think I'm at my 10-minute mark, Phillip. So I'll close there. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Mike. That's fantastic. And so, and I, I failed to, let's see, I'm trying to navigate. Give me one second. Why am I not maxing this out? Oh, sorry. Zoom H. I failed to mention the title of Mike's book. So here it is, Befriending the Queer 19th Century Curious Attachment. So make sure you go look that up. It's amazing. Mike's an amazing scholar. So thanks so much, Mike. So next up, we'll hear from our own Matt de la Peña, and his latest picture book for children is Milo Imagines the World. So with that, I shall turn it over to Matt. Take it away, Matt.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be with colleagues. I will just start by saying that I got my MFA in the program at San Diego State. And I remember being there on one particular class day, and I had a professor named Hal Jaffe, and he called into question something I said. I said, I'm not a political person. And he kind of chastised me. He's here today. And he said, all writing is political. And at the time, I really didn't understand what that meant. But I think in the years since I left the program, I've really leaned in to that idea. And to take it a step further, I think writing for young people, which is what I do, is an activism. So I try to tell great stories, but I also try to sort of, question the status quo or include as much diversity as possible in my stories. So this is my 15th book, and it's called Milo Imagines the World. I write young adult novels, but I also write picture books, and this is a picture book. And I've been so fortunate the past couple of years to be at San Diego State teaching creative writing, but also a children's literature class. And I get to watch really intelligent students sort of break apart, what's happening in children's literature. And it's pretty profound and amazing. I think a couple of the students are on here today. So I feel very fortunate I get to witness that. I wanted to kind of talk about where this book came from. And then because it's a picture book, I get to read it to you, the whole thing. So I remember early in my career, it was about 2000, maybe 12. I was invited to Minneapolis to be a guest at their teen book festival. It's a very well-known teen book festival. They pay their authors really well. So of course I went for it. But the organizer said, maybe you could come out early and you could go to the different prisons in our city in Minneapolis, because I just had released a young adult novel called We Were Here about kids living in a group home where I worked for a couple of years. So I went out early. I went to the men's prison, the women's prison, and the juvenile hall system. And I think writers, we don't often have answers to sort of the questions of the day, but I think we're drawn to them. And I remember just sitting in those prisons each hour that I was there. And I was noticing, the population here is about 95% Black and brown. Next day, I went to the Teen Book Festival and it was 95% white. So you just notice these things and you wonder what's going on there. So I was sort of drawn to that territory as a novelist, but just this past year, I was drawn to it as a picture book writer. I also got to work with Cristian Robinson on this book, who actually grew up similar to the character in this book. He grew up with an incarcerated mother. Many of you probably know this, but America has 4% of the world population, but 20% of the incarcerated population. So obviously this is, in relative terms, a sort of uncommon story, but it's not that uncommon, not as uncommon as it should be. So I'm going to read the book to y'all. All right. You ready for a picture book? It's story time. Milo Imagines the World. And I always invite readers to kind of look at this image at the beginning and kind of think about who these people might be, what they're doing, where they might be living, what's going on with this blue cat. Because you're going to see this image a little bit later in the book and you'll probably understand a lot more about the characters. And this is the first book I've ever written that takes place in New York, where I lived for 15 years before moving back here. What begins as a slow, distant glow grows and grows into a tired train that clatters down the tracks. A cool rush of wind quiets into a screech of steel. And when the doors slide open, Milo slips aboard. The train bucks back into motion as he and his sister squeeze onto bench seats. The whiskered man beside Milo has a face of concentration. A businessman has a blank, lonely face. The wedding dress woman near the far door has a face made out of light, while the dog peeking out of her handbag has no face at all, just a long, lolling tongue. These monthly Sunday subway rides are never ending, and as usual, Milo is a shook-up soda. Excitement stacked on top of worry, on top of confusion, on top of love. To keep himself from bursting, he studies the faces around him and makes pictures of their lives. So Milo's a budding artist looking around. At a downtown local stop, the whiskered man folds up his crossword and hurries off the train. Milo imagines him trudging through brown mounds of slush. It's a 5-flight climb to his cluttered apartment where he's greeted by mewling cats and burrowing rats. Parakeets tweet songs of longing as the man sips tepid soup, hunched over a game of solitaire. Late that night, the door to the parakeet cage mysteriously falls open, and the cats gather on the cold sill to watch the birds fly free above the city. And in his drawings, there always seems to be some form of emancipation. Milo tugs his sister's sleeve and holds up his picture. But even when she turns to look, he can tell she doesn't see. She's a shook-up soda too. A boy in a suit boards the train with his dad. His hair is a perfect part, and there's not a single scuff on his bright white Nikes. Milo imagines the clop, clop, clop of the horse-drawn carriage that will carry him to his castle, imagines the clink, clink, clink of the guards slowly lowering the drawbridge. Across the human-made moat, the boy is met by a butler, 2 maids, and a gourmet chef offering crust-free sandwich squares. So according to Milo's drawing, this boy is living a very fancy life. He even has a crown. Milo flips to a fresh page at a bustling Midtown stop. When the wedding-dressed woman strides off the train, a band of street performers launches into Here Comes the Bride, and everyone on the platform stops and cheers. Milo imagines the grand cathedral ceremony where the couple will be pronounced husband and wife, imagines the groom whisking his new bride to an awaiting hot air balloon where the pilot loads them in with blankets and blasts the heat. And up, up they go, hand in hand, beyond the concrete walls of the city, into the infinite blue. Milo holds up this picture too, but his sister shoos him away. Can't you see I'm playing my game? He watches her thumbs bang around her smudged screen, then turns back to the boy in the suit. They lock eyes for a few long seconds, and suddenly it feels like the walls are closing in around Milo. The spell is broken when a crew of breakers bounds onto the train announcing, "You all ready for a show?" Several curious faces look up as the beat drops, and now the girls are walking up walls. They're whirling around poles. They're backflipping over shopping bags. When the train pulls into the next stop, they collect a few dollars and scramble for another car. Milo imagines them going from train to train, doing their act as everyone watches. But even after the performances are over, faces still follow their every move. When they walk down the electronics aisle at the department store, when they cross into the fancy neighborhood. Milo doesn't really like this picture, so he puts away his pad and turns to his reflection in the window. What do people imagine about his face? Can they see him reciting his volcano poem to the class? Can they hear his mom's soothing voice reading him a bedtime book over the phone? Can they smell the chili Colorado bubbling in a pot in his auntie's apartment near the cemetery? Butterflies flood Milo's stomach when it's finally their stop. He follows his sister onto the cold station platform and up the stairs. Above ground, he's surprised to see the boy in the suit a few paces ahead. He's even more surprised when the boy joins the long line to pass through the metal detector. Milo's sister suddenly bends to give him a hug. "I didn't mean to snap at you," she says. She takes his hand, adding, "You have your picture ready?" He nods, feeling the warmth of her fingers. As they slowly shuffle forward, Milo studies the boy in the suit, his dad rubbing his thin shoulders, and a thought occurs to him. Maybe you can't really know anyone just by looking at their face. Milo tries to reimagine all the pictures he made on the train. Maybe he could have done it like this instead. Maybe the whiskered man isn't going home to a lonely, cluttered apartment, but he's met by a family that's excited to see him. Or this, maybe he had it all wrong, who this wedding dress woman was going off to marry. Or this, maybe one of the breakdancing girls lives in the nice neighborhood, in the fancy building. And maybe instead of the doorman shooing them away, he's welcoming them home. Milo's chest fills with excitement when he spots his mom through the crowd. His sister rushes to give her a hug before pulling Milo in too. And it's in this tight tangle of familiar arms that he feels most alive. When they separate, Milo flips through his pad until he finds the right picture. "I made this for you," he says, holding it up, and he watches for the smile he hopes will spread across his mom's face. And the book ends with the reader getting to see the picture that Milo's showing his mom. And you probably remember this picture. But now we know who these people are. And we see where his imagination is taking him to a place where he hopes they will be getting back to soon. And I'll just close by saying, when you write a picture book, you allow for the different audiences that you have. You have the child, but you also often have the parent that's reading to the child or the teacher that's reading to the class. And so I try to find different entry points. And this book in particular, I hope challenges not only people to think about how we're all growing up different and how some of us have difficult circumstances, but also to be generous when we look at other people. Today, we're being asked to stay 6 feet apart from everyone. There are masks on people's faces. It's harder to sort of, lean on what you see to base opinions, when we put people in boxes and put them on shelves. So I just am trying to advocate in this book and pretty much all my work to sort of look at other people with generosity and to know that there's an entire story behind their face that we don't have access to. So thank you all for letting me do story time with you.
Yay, thanks so much, Matt. That was gorgeous. Oh, goodness, that was gorgeous. Thank you so much. Okay, so next up, we have Yetta Howard. Yetta will be talking about her latest book. I'm trying to pull up a cover. Rated RX, Sherry Rose with and After Bob Flanagan. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Yetta.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Philip. Can you hear me okay? How's the audio? Sorry. All right, thanks, Philip, Kim, and Jessica for organizing this, and thanks to Matt, Mike, Hal for celebrating together collectively. I should put the timer on, or else I'll just keep talking. I have my timer on now for 10 minutes. And I'm going to share screen, NSFW, not safe for work, some of it. Let's see here. I'll try to not make it too extreme this time. And I'm sharing it from the ebook, so I hope it doesn't crash the system here. But I do recommend getting the paperback, which is the same price as the ebook. And one of the grants I was able to get, I didn't get all the grants I wanted, but one of the grants I was able to get meant that the paper stock is really nice, and it's 20, if you do the discount, it's 20% off from free shipping, and it runs about $25, which is not bad for a paperback archive book. And it's I can give you the information if you're interested in purchasing it. All right, so I guess one of the things, this is a very different kind of book for me. I wrote my monograph my monograph was published about 2 years ago in 2018, and I was actually working on this book. It's an edited collection, and I was sort of working on it simultaneously while writing my first book and going up for tenure. And this book took many many years, and it's probably the most labor-intensive thing I've ever done. I probably won't do anything like this again, and I wouldn't recommend doing something like this until after you have tenure. But the idea was, and let me share screen, was, you know, in thinking about, hold on, here we go. In thinking about like sort of famous, can you guys see that okay? The ebook, okay. And thinking about these sort of like famous art couples, you know, Christo and Jean-Claude, the Keenholzes, Edward and Nancy Keenholz, even Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera. You know, feminist art history has sort of shown us that really there's a kind of like latency with even appreciating or even understanding the female counterpart as, you know, an artist in her own right. And Bob Flanagan and Sherry Rose, while, you know, sort of maybe not well known in terms of the larger art history, they're very well known in relationship to underground performance art practices and BDSM subcultural history. And for those who don't know what BDSM stands for, the BD is bondage and discipline, DS is domination and submission, and SM is sadomasochism. And a lot of the shorthand is sort of S&M or SM, but really the way you talk about it is BDSM. And so I was interested in, you know, Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan for many, many years. And there's been quite a bit of work on Bob Flanagan, but there's been sort of really no attention to Sherry Rose. And the difference with Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan, unlike some of the other art couples that I named, the Keenholzes, etc., was that Rose and Flanagan made their sex lives into art practice. And they lived a 24/7. This wasn't just like we do the performance art and we come home. This was a 24/7 mistress-slave relationship. And what they did was perform a lot of these sort of extreme acts in, they sort of merged a lot of that into the artwork. The other difference with Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan was Bob had cystic fibrosis, and he was the oldest living person at the time to have live with cystic fibrosis. But you know, they were said to have these sort of, or it was thought at the time that his extreme masochism contributed to his longevity. He died when he was just a little younger than I. He died at age 43. I'm 45. So he lived a pretty long life. And so I was interested in, you know, really thinking about not Bob, but really having a project that focused on Sherry, and not only because of the sort of parity between them, but in 2014, Sherry donated her entire archive of you know, materials, posters, tapes, all kinds of, you know, materials to the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives. And it was at that point that she and I had started to talk about, you know, a book project. And I had, and just, you know, so you know that sexism is real, regardless of whether you're in dominant culture or whether you're in underground culture. It was really hard for me to get a book contract for this. I was going to art presses and they all wanted a book on Bob. And I said, well, this is actually not a book on Bob, it's a book on Sherry. And Sherry had been doing a range of performances in the 2010s. From 2013 through 2017, she had done a range of performances that some of it which she had thought about with Bob, but he ran out of time to live. And then she collaborated with other artists, one being Martin O'Brien, who's a queer British performance artist, and you know, who also has CF, by the way. And he's about 30 years old now, I think. And so I was interested in a lot of things here in relationship to disability politics. I'll try to sum it up. There's just really, I have 3 minutes left. So I'll try to sum it up. So I was interested in, some of these ideas of, the crip body daring to be sexual, the older body. And again, Sherry is 79 years old right now, and she is still doing performances. To this day, she has one this summer too, and so, the sort of older body that continues to do performance, and a range of other minority body politics that sort of find themselves on the margins of not only sexuality, but also performance art, and even just like the figure of the dom and things like that. And so there, in a lot of the performances from 2013 through 2000.
Hey, I lost you.
Oh, am I there? No. Hello.
Yeah, you're here yet. I think somebody just might have momentarily unmuted
Okay.
themselves.
All
So
right.
we're good.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I always think these things are. I always assume it's my thing.
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good. Continue.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to share some more images here. I'm afraid it's going to crash the system because it's the ebook. But I was also attending the performances from 2013 to 2017 and documenting some of those. And so this book was, archival work, all the work of an edited collection, and documenting the performances from 2013 to 2017. And if you take a look at, let me pull up the TOC here. Sorry, I have to like verbalize it here. If you take a look at the TOC here, I have it, divided into Sherry's writing, collaborative and critical perspectives. And so we have, major art historians like Amelia Jones and Amber Jamila Muster, and then performative writing, one of whom is our very own Hal Jaffe, that has, I wanted like a range of writing styles because Sherry and Bob were, are ultimately artists. And Sherry, before, in addition to doing the performance art, had spent years in the 80s documenting piercing and tattooing underground. She was the staff photographer for Beyond Baroque in Venice, which many people know has a very long reputation of literary, events and things like that still to this day. And then I have the images. So it's a very, comprehensive book. And, you can't really see the process here, but this is, the result of years and years of archival work, attending performances from 2013 to 2017, and then all of the work of the sort of edited collection. So if anyone's like edited a book or co-edited a book and knows how much work that is, that was like one small part of this. A lot of this was, the archival work and sort of selecting the images. So I wouldn't call this an art book, it's more an archive book. And so again, a lot of what, I'll try to sum this up. Okay, I'm at my 10-minute mark, but a lot of what this book tries to do is, look at things like time and endurance. A lot of the recent performances, some of them were like 24 hours long, which speaks to questions of age, but it also speaks to questions of revised time in relationship to ill time, lived time. What does it mean to have a 24/7, BDSM relationships? Translate that into performance practices, and then look at it, a couple decades later, and do these sort of durational 12-hour pieces, 24-hour pieces, where the body is sort of like relinquishing control. And there's really a lot more, but I just want to leave you with one image here. I can't believe I didn't actually show more extreme images, but that's what you get here. Part 2. in this breathing space section, I have this, you know, I tried to make the book itself performative, and I have this like breathing space section because breathing is such an important part of even thinking about not just CF, cystic fibrosis, but things like Sherry's a lifelong yoga practitioner, and she took some death portraits where both Bob and her mother, and both of their mouths are agape, taking their last breaths. But I have this sort of breathing space section, and in it, there's this S that she carves, that she had carved into Bob, that she will, you know, carve into a lot of her collaborators. And the S is supposed to stand for many, many things: Sherry, slave, sick, super masochist. And, you know, you'll see this in a range of other, you know, of other performances. She's carved it on Martin. And there's many images. There's 80 images and rare archival materials in here. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. I know that that's, you know, it's like I wrote down notes here, and of course I write down the notes to keep myself organized, and then I never follow the notes. So that's about it. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Yetta. Being a professor is all about making notes and then forgetting all about them by the time you actually go into the space to speak. But this is such important work, and I'm really glad that you know, this, you know, all these years of labor are able to now, you know, kind of come into fruition with this particular project, which is such an important contribution. So very well done. You know, congrats, Yetta. Next up. And our fourth and final speaker is Hal Jaffe, and he will be talking about his latest publication, Brute, Writings on Art and Artists. And so with that, I shall turn it over to Hal.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate everybody inviting me here. You know, I've been separated because I'm a professor emeritus now, although I'm continuing to edit Fiction International, and I'm FERPing, so I am teaching now laboriously, you know, via Zoom. In fact, the current issue of Fiction International, which is related somewhat to what I'm going to say, is on compassion. But the notion of brute that I refer to was coined by the French painter Jean Dubuffet in 1949 to refer to institutionalized mental patients who were creating powerful art, usually painting and sculpture. I choose a number of writers, artists, and films, such as Black Orpheus, for example, and some of the Pasolini films. In every instance, or virtually every instance, I choose artists who manage to transfigure their emotional pain into art. A tragic art, of course, which is arguably the highest art. I include Sylvia Plath, Nina Simone, Simone Weil, Clarice Lispector, Samuel Beckett, Baldwin, John Coltrane, Frantz Fanon, Black Elk, the Oglala Sioux shaman and cousin to Crazy Horse, Antonin Artaud, and as Yetta graciously put it, something about Bob Flanagan here as well. I want to, I think probably the best thing for me to do is to read a couple of very, very short pieces. I should say, though, that talking about these artists who have transfigured extreme emotional pain into art, two artists are perhaps different, John Berger and Artaud. Berger himself did not seem to suffer emotionally, but he was committed to writing about humans who did suffer. Artaud suffered enormously and wanted his tormented body rather than his often unhinged but potent writing to represent his art. That is, his great emotional pain is to be transfigured not into his writings, but into his wasted, tormented body. Yukio Mishima was also rather different, but I don't think I'll have time to talk about Mishima. Now, crucial to add that this transfiguration to which I refer is nearly always into an art that points outward to the world in pain. I'd like to read a couple of very short texts. One is about Coltrane when he comes to Japan, Nagasaki. I don't have the images. There's something on YouTube now with the images, several of them relating to this text, to the various texts, but I don't have access to that now. When John Coltrane visited Nagasaki in 1966, Nagasaki had not recovered emotionally from the US atom bomb attack 3 days after the US bombed Hiroshima in August 1945. When the car transporting John and Alice Coltrane pulled up to the greeting area in Nagasaki, Alice got out, but Train stayed in the car playing notes on a flute. The Japanese host looked into the car and asked him what he was doing. John Coltrane whispered that he was trying to find the right music to commemorate Nagasaki. Later, a Japanese jazz fan asked Coltrane an odd question. What do you expect to be 10 years from now? Train answered at once, a saint. John Coltrane died the following year, 40 years old. Now I'd like to read something that's a little bit more rhetorical, also quite short, which also points to what I'm doing. I call it No, Not No. Pardon me. Sylvia Plath was attacked because she compared her emotional pain to the Holocaust with a capital H. Susan Sontag observed that while the Soviets were everywhere advertised as the arch enemy of capitalism, capitalism adored the Nazis because they were charismatic like sharks and serial killers. Elizabeth Costello, Kutzia's protagonist in The Lives of Animals, insists that the meat slaughtering industry is equivalent to the Holocaust with a capital H. When a writer asked Kafka how he was faring, Kay's response was, I consider it a blessing to simply stand in the corner and breathe. Crazy Horse, Sioux warrior and priest, was murdered young. He didn't permit himself to be photographed. His burial place has never been revealed. About William Blake, who distrusted the French, Bataille said he was a man who never pursed his lips. Simone Weil said in 1940, as countries were knuckling under to fascism, that she felt as if the center were shredding. We are in 2021. The center has shredded. I want to read one other very short text, and then I'll stop. It's by Pasolini, Pier Paolo Pasolini, the director. He wasn't only a director, he was a man of parts who did a number of things. And I'm trying to find where my Pasolini is. Here it is, 15. And there's some curious things about him, especially after he died, but in fact, while he was alive as well. Pasolini. About Pier Paolo Pasolini, a contemporary said, he was compelled to live dangerously in every sense, this passionate, brilliant, contradictory man. filmmaker, poet, novelist, Marxist, homosexual, living and trying to love in mid-century Italy. See the shining contradictory facets in his remarkable face. All angles, pointed one way beautiful, another way pitiful, a third way saintly. Pasolini visited the ragazzi, poor boys in the slums on the outskirts of Rome, paid them for allowing him to love them. After years of these regular visits, one Sunday he met friends for luncheon, seemed more or less as usual, phoned his mother with whom he lived, then drove to the outskirts of Rome. In the next reel, he is found dead, his trousers at his knees, his testicles crushed, his face and body burnt with violent wheel marks over it. The official finding concluded that Pasolini visited his ragazzi, antagonized them somehow, after which they murdered him savagely, driving his car back and forth over his burnt dead body. However, years later, a theory floated. Pasolini deliberately provoked his sordid murder to demonstrate the dread meaning of life, employing himself as shaman. I believe that strange story, and in truth, I admire it. I think of other figures who might get themselves murdered to demonstrate a principle. Rimbaud comes to mind, Simone Weil, Lorca, Artaud, John Coltrane, Vincent van Gogh, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hal. Just so thought-provoking and just so timely. Your work is always just so timely and offers readers so much at any kind of a given moment. So thank you so much, and to all four of you, it really is an honor for you all to be my colleagues. We'll open it up to questions now. Chat. Kim will open up the chat so that if you wish, you can enter a question in the chat, or you can also raise a blue hand, or if you're feeling even more daring, you can just unmute yourself. I'll just start off with an observation that we have these four seemingly very different types of texts, these four different types of books that have been shared today. On the one hand, I think that the diversity of the kinds of work that has been shared here today is emblematic of our department, and it's an attestation to what makes our department so special. The kind of the different types of work, but also the importance of the work that we do in that regard. And then the other thing that I was thinking about, there was like two other things, is that one is that when Matt was talking, he mentioned the lesson that he learned from Hal, which is that writing is activism. And I think that across all four of the books that we heard about today, I think we can say that, yeah, that is certainly the case. All four books are acts of activism. And then, when Hal was talking about the title of his book, I was thinking about how, okay, so the most powerful art is different, in its thinking, in its form, and its execution. And, again, I think that with all four books, we can say that they are all powerful works of art. They are all about different thinking and all very important in that regard. So thank you all again for sharing your work, and congratulations to you all on these publications. Okay, so chat is open. You can blue hand it. You can unmute yourself with any questions that you may have, or you can enter something into the chat. We turn it over to you now to ask our four faculty authors.
Hi, this is Robert Cross, former student. I had a question for Hal. So the painting behind Professor Pressman reminds me of Rothko, and you talk about Rothko in your book. So I was wondering if you can kind of shed some light on that piece.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, after Rothko died, allegedly administering 64 cuts to his body on his 64th birthday. Some people said eerily that the blood somehow resembled one of his paintings, though with uneven edges. I wrote something called Rothko 66, where I compared two kinds of art. As I was walking from where I lived in the village to the Guggenheim Museum, where they had the exhibit, I stopped at a toilet and a luncheonette, and I saw scrawled at the bottom of the door when you closed it, "I will die. I will die today. I will kill myself today, black." That's what it said. "I will kill myself today, black." And I compare the brilliance of these two artists. Rothko, whose canvases sold for millions of dollars, and this person who was perhaps black and was suffering a great deal, and was only able to write his pain in that way. And I call it art. Rothko's is obviously art, but I call the other art because of the terrible suffering it implied, not only on his part, but on the part of the people everywhere, the dispossessed everywhere. The refugees, many more than there were after the Second World War, that we never hear from. We don't even hear about, the children at the border, etc. And so I think maybe the provocative notion there is that I chose to call both art almost equally art. Okay, thank you, Robert.
Thanks. So there's a question in the chat for Mike. This is from Jacob Johnson. They ask, "I have a question for Borgstrom. Can you explain the idea of textual befriending in regards to queerness? Is it that the act of befriending is queer in your reading, or that the type of befriending being textual is queer?"
Interesting question. Thanks, Jacob. It's actually neither. The act of befriending is something that could transcend any particular sort of impulse to understand or express curiosity about that which we have interest in. So for the purposes of my book, it's simply using the idea of coming to terms with queerness in a cultural sense, in a social sense, as an example of how befriending works. In other words, the emphasis is on the act of befriending, which is a different kind of attitudinal disposition than like being nosy or being, prurient. It's more about opening yourself up to the possibility of attachment and the possibility of making connection that is predicated then on understanding that that gesture necessitates difference, but you're willing to make the overture itself. Does that make sense? So I don't mean to conflate befriending and queer. I'm using the idea of what I saw my students doing with trying to come to terms with queerness as an act itself of befriending that which they had curiosity in.
Thanks, Mike. So this is an invitation from our own Dr. Pressman for the four of you to talk about the intersections that you notice between your works. Dr. Pressman writes, "All of the works seem also to be about attachment, the attachments we have to art/literature and what it means to be human. Would love to hear more about what the speakers think about the connections between the work presented today. Just curious." Curious seems a bit of a buzzword for us today. So take it away, four speakers.
Jess, this is an impossible question, I think. It's a great one. I would just say this, like, I don't want to speak, to the possibilities that Yet is bringing up in her book, or that Hal is bringing up in his book, or that Matt is bringing up in his book, because those are specific to their particular projects. But what I would say is this, is that for me, attachments help us to constitute the self, even while they move outward through quite diverse orientations. So in my view, attachment is itself relentlessly social, even if the terms of that sociality are really manifested in interesting and diverse ways, like the kind of work that Yetta's talking about with Sherry Rose, for instance, or even to look at the kind of like double nature of the illustrations in Matt's work. So Jess, like I said, like a difficult question to answer, and one that you could probably answer yourself since you posed the question in the first place.
But what's the fun of me answering it when I have 4 smart people that could answer it?
I would just add, it seems that in the case of all 4 people speaking today, that there's a searching in the margins for stories instead of in the sort of the mainstream or what we see in media today in general. So it seems like there's a seeking in the margins. I also think there's a reckoning of trying to understand how we see the world and the different ways to see the world, or the characters, or the personalities, and the way the world sees us or these personalities.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard question to answer, but yeah, I mean, just I think, I mean, in the case of Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan and the ghost of Bob Flanagan and the recent collaborative work, I mean, so much about what's at stake in terms of even understanding the feminist project, at least in my book, is understanding the dynamics of BDSM, okay? Understanding that, like, the mistress, the top, somebody who's the dominant is maybe not going to be seen as, say, as important as the body being worked on. But, you know, if you're understanding Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan, everything that Bob did was for Sherry, okay? And if you take a look at, you know, his penis being pierced in several places, that's Sherry's work. If you take a look at the recent performances where she's performing with Rhiannon Ahrens, like it was right around 2017, with all of the anti-abortion legislation, she and Rhiannon Ahrens was a professional dominatrix, they did a performance called An Illegal Operation for Mary Toff, where Sherry extracted a stuffed animal rabbit from Rhiannon's vaginal cavity and, you know, wrapped tightly up in a condom or else she would have done toxic shock syndrome. But I think the idea of attachment in whatever form we're sort of thinking about it can extend in how we even think about collaborative practice. I'm thinking, Matt, of, you know, even doing like a picture book, you're thinking about it in terms of the art too. You're not, I mean, when we're looking at it. And then I love that you had the like the image of we see the child's drawings as well. So there's this kind of you know, constellation of creative practices there. So I don't know, those are just some of my random thoughts on that, but I tried to answer it specifically in terms of mine.
Any thoughts, Al, on the connection of your work to the others presented today?
I don't know, Lord. Yeah, margin, those people unheard. Generally, those notions that have been outlawed, or that's what I'm interested in primarily, and I think that's something that the other 3 you know, writers have also spoken about. Yeah, I'd say that.
Great. Our next question comes from incoming MA student Danny Nuriazad. She writes, feeling extremely grateful to have had the privilege to have learned from some of the professors here today. That said, I selfishly have a couple of questions. And the first question is for Professor de la Peña. In your class, we learned about the importance of reframing in children's literature. Here you spoke about images of emancipation while showing us a plot line with an incarcerated character. Could you speak a bit more on the risks that you took here, if there were any, and how this book endeavors to reframe our own thinking about tougher issues like incarceration and BIPOC liberation?
Oh, wow. By the way, Danny was such an amazing student. I'm so happy that she's going into the MA program. She's going to do amazing work. Yeah, some of the stuff she turned in, I was blown away by. So I have a saying above my computer when I write that says, do not write what you see, write what will be seen. And I think that really is what I try to do with my work. I think when I first started publishing, 2005, my first book came out. And what happened is I was writing a lot about my own mixed race identity. And, you know, a lot of people, even though I was mixed, they put me in the category of a Mexican author. And what happens there in 2005 is when you are publishing with the major publishers, they would be tempted to say, well, we have our Mexican author now, and sort of close the door for somebody writing something similar. And we've seen a real change, you know, a real shift culturally in the publishing industry where now they want multiple versions of the stories that I was telling back then, that update what I was doing, that are updating what somebody like Jackie Woodson was doing. And so I think maybe life, similar to literature, is about being able to reimagine the world. So even though this book is called Milo Imagines the World, it's really about being open to reimagining the world. And one of the greatest things for me, greatest privileges about writing for young people is it's different from adult readers. So a lot of adult readers, in my opinion, they sort of read to reinforce their own ideology. So they seek books that reaffirm what they already believe. And they like to read to say, yeah, that's what I think too. And I'm talking about, you know, outside of academia. Well, young people haven't formed an ideology yet, and they're more open to different ideas, and they're still seeking answers, right? And so when you look at a picture book like this, we didn't know if we could work with incarceration in a picture book. We didn't know if we would be allowed to do it. So then I have to kind of calibrate, how loud do I want that part of the story to be? Well, the truth is some kids won't even know where the mother is. But then some kids who are a little older or have that kind of shared experience, they might ask questions. What did the mother do? You know, things like that. You know, how did she get there? So I think literature is a continual process of reimagining stories that we've all seen before. And so hopefully in my books, you find a diverse cast and a very inclusive cast.
Thanks, Matt. Danny also has a question for Dr. Howard. Dr. Howard, you touched on the idea of your book as performance itself, with even the publication process proving difficult. Could you expand on the ways your book performs Sherry Rose's archives and how they are oriented in the book for readers to consume as a performance rather than an art book?
Wow, and I'm so glad that Danny was also one of my students, and Danny was just amazing scholar. We're really excited to have you coming to do an MA here. Yes, it's a really good question. I mean, I think the question also reaches out toward the difficulty of even documenting and thinking about what it means to work on performance, and something that is not really meant to be static. And so what I tried to do, at least in terms of keeping to some of those performative elements, was not only obviously having in terms of the writing, included having a whole section on performative writing, and Hal is one of the authors there. Also, Marianne Davis's Oatmeal and Shit essays is actually one of my favorite essays in there, and she's a poet and a scholar, where she's sort of talking about her experience in the Rose Flanagan collection. There's that aspect, but then there's also I don't know if I can pull this up. What I tried to do was not have the images and the writing thrown together in a way that is directed, and I have the words and the images separately. And there are thumbnails that kind of direct the reader, not just the reader experiencer is what I like to say. The reader experiencer to sections in the book. Let me see where, like here, for example. So it's meant to be, so it's not sort of, so that the process of reading the book isn't experienced linearly. It's basically, you're in the word section, then there'll be a thumbnail here that points you to the section, and in the sort of curatorial aspect of the images section, it'll point you back to some essays. So it's supposed to be, out of time and non-linear, so that you're experiencing it in a kind of performative framework. I'd also included a section called breathing space, that like the carved S that you saw is one of the ways that it kind of works with how she is using her strategies, life art strategies across time. So you'll see the carved S on in a range of different performances. But also to your question, I think it's important to think about how their performances also kind of do other kinds do work as well. So the re-performances. So for example, the Memento Mori Death Trilogy, only one of those performances were realized when Bob was alive, and so she re-performed those. They were never realized, but she did those in some of those in 2013 through 2017. One of those was done at the One Archives, and it was just sort of fascinating. It was the Dust to Dust performance, and they were sort of like performing. There was a gap in the archive, and then they performed it not on a stage or something, but they actually performed it at the archives. So it's almost as if the archive itself became this kind of living, breathing thing, and then the book is as much as possible in book form. I mean, there's obviously limitations when you're talking about performance in the sort of static book form. That I tried to, as much as possible, reproduce or allow for like movement between the sections, while not being too chaotic. But of course, any archival work is going to be chaotic. Any time you're thinking about performance art, and especially extreme performance art that works with the ill body and the sick body, that's going to invite unexpected moments. And so I try to sort of do that in terms of the structure of the book, but I think that the performances themselves also speak to the sort of movable and instability of the archive itself and its performative dynamics. I hope that answers it kind of.
And as you're describing that, Yetta, I mean, I can't help but think about, as you're describing this kind of experimental form, for your book, I can't help but think that all four books actually in their own ways, are distinguished by this kind of experimental quality. And so I actually wanted to use that as a way to ask Mike a question, because I remember, Mike, when you were working on the book, you were talking about ways that like you were taking risks with its writing style, with the style, and how this is kind of, you were experiencing it as something that was very different from what would typically be expected of a scholarly book. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like how you experienced this, what kind of experimentalism you kind of experienced in this, with this particular book as you were writing it.
Well, yeah, thanks, Philip. everything is relative. I mean, I am hesitating to say that it's some kind of radical departure from any of the sort of academic stuff that we read, particularly in light of like Hal's work or Yetta's work, for instance. But for the kind of work that I was trained to do, and that you were trained to do, because you were the colleague that I was referring to at the beginning of my talk, the ones who we sort of came out to each other about actually wanting to talk about value again in our work. It just seemed to me necessary to write in a different idiom. And so I've been really inspired by other kinds of writers who write in a way that is accessible, but it is still, meaningful. So I'm thinking here of Rita Felsky, for instance, or Jill Lepore, like the ways in which we can write that doesn't necessarily bind the Academy off from larger readers. And so I guess most selfishly, I think about my mom in this regard, like somebody who did not go to college, but is very smart and would want to know what it is that I'm doing and what I'm thinking, and wanting to write in a way that would be accessible. And I don't mean that in any kind of condescending way whatsoever. I just think that there are ways in which we perhaps need to retrain some of the lessons that we've inculcated in graduate school to redirect where we want our intellectual energies to go and to what purpose they might be, sort of directed. And I'm looking at what Matt asked me in the chat as well, where asking if this was the first time I was ever inspired, writing a book that was inspired by what I'm seeing in the classroom. The answer, Matt, is no, actually. But it's the first book in which I sort of felt like I wanted to put those experiences front and center as a way to acknowledge the real work that happens in the classroom that often gets dissected or divorced from what counts as legitimate literary criticism. I think those are false distinctions. I think that they do really ill service to the mission of the university. And I think it's incredibly important to highlight that kind of work at a time when, as I said in my brief little talk, that the work of the humanities is often disparaged as having no usefulness whatsoever. So by trying to sort of foreground what that actual work might look like in a way that therefore is also accessible to readers like my mom, all of those things kind of come together, Philip, to sort of produce a work that freed me up a little bit to write in a different kind of idiom than I normally would have written in when I was trained, as many of us were, in like, high theory and sort of a distanced appraisal of the materials that we consider. So, Philip, I hope that answers your question, and I hope it answers Matt's at the same time.
Yeah, I think so. It's quite an efficient teaching there, Dr. Borgstrom. Cover two questions all at once. We have a question for Matt from our superstar office staff, Kim. Kim asks, Kim says first, loved your book. I also looked at Cristian Robinson's art and I love his style. And Kim is an art major. Can you talk about how the collaboration between you and Cristian happened and how both of your experiences shaped the book? She's very interested in the process.
Yeah, and Kim is a very, very good artist. I've seen some of her work, but I love what Michael said. Real quick, I wanted to comment about the writing style. I remember reading early on in my career about Sandra Cisneros when she wrote The House on Mango Street, and trying to appeal to two audiences at the same time, which is the MFA Iowa world and also her family, and like how hard that is. That's a really hard, to sort of balance those audiences. So I think it's cool that you tried to do that in academic work. In terms of working with Cristian, this is our third book, and I think we were very fortunate. I never set out to write a picture book, but it sort of just came to me, and now I have two small children, so I'm sort of in that world, reading a lot of picture books, and I see what you can do with the picture book. We were very fortunate. Cristian Robinson and I, our first book won the Newbery medal, and the benefit of winning an award, which, I'll readily admit is like an arbitrary thing. 12 people decide who wins it this year. If it was any other group of people, it might not have been our book. But the benefit of winning an award like that is that you can write any story you want, and the publisher will give it a chance. And the the independent bookstores, but also the big chains will give it a chance. So that frees you up to write what you really want. So this is our third collaboration. Our second one is dealing with immigration, and mixed status families, a little girl who has a dad who's undocumented and gets deported, but a mom who's an American citizen. And my dad grew up that way, with a mixed status family. So we wanted to sort of show how common of an American story that is. 16 million people are growing up in mixed status families. So when we came to Milo, both of us are very much interested in what does it mean to be growing up in a working class community? What does it mean to be sort of quote unquote other? And then I really love what you can do in a picture book with the unconscious of the young protagonist. So I think most of us have read Where the Wild Things Are. And so we can use that as a reference. Well, in Where the Wild Things Are, you have a little boy who's sent to bed without his dinner. And then he goes to this dream space where he tries on adult sensibilities. He tries on, he's sending the monsters to bed without their supper, right? And so he's practicing this. There's another picture book called The Dead Bird, where a group of kids find a dead bird and they figure out what to do with it. And they're trying on adult ceremonies, like singing to it after burying it. So with this book, I wanted to kind of play with that a little bit. So if you look at Milo, every time he draws a picture, he imagines some form of incarceration. Either it's the birds flying free, right? They're being released, so emancipated. The married couple goes up in the hot air balloon, so they're like leaving the walls of the city. But then there's also the young white boy who he thinks has a perfect life, who is actually closing the walls around him with the drawbridge to keep the dangerous people out, right? So that's like closing yourself in to be safe. So there's those two different things happening. And I think that's a fascinating thing you can do with a picture book. I always tell my classes, of course, many kids aren't going to be able to consciously point to that and know what's happening in the story. But I think it's unfortunate that we think it means more to get something consciously, like in an academic setting, than to get something viscerally. Because I think that's a powerful and sometimes life-changing experience, to get something visceral and not be able to explain it, but just feel it. So we tried to do that. And then I'll end by just saying, Cristian, the illustrator, we sat down together and he actually said, I would love to explore how I grew up with an incarcerated mother in LA. And he basically gave me a gift and a challenge, like, can I do this in a picture book, which I'd already done it in novels. And so I really just thought about, what does it mean when you put a kid in a group home or an adult in prison? And I think what's really happening is you're putting the people that you're worried about off over into the margins so that you can feel safe in your space. But my goal, and I think Cristian's goal too, is to show moments of grace and dignity that takes place in those places, like on the quote unquote wrong side of the tracks, or in these working class communities. So hopefully that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Matt, so much. We have time for maybe one last question. If anybody wants to enter into the chat, or just unmute yourself or raise a blue hand. Your last shot at asking our 4 faculty authors a question.
Well, I'd like to just, I had to leave the meeting early. I met with 2 students and then with one of my kids' teachers. So I've had a really busy day here, but I wanted to get back and just congratulate everybody here on their new books. I'm going to be working on my new book over the summer and then sabbatical in the fall. So I know that challenge of actually bringing a book into fullness and fruition and bringing it out. It's a beautiful thing to do, especially in a toxic environment like the one we live in. I'm not specifically referring to San Diego State. I'm more referring to the COVID United States, the Trump era, and the other side of that. But congratulations to all of you for producing those great books. I've read Hal's book already, and I highly recommend it. I haven't read the other three, but I'm glad to have some time to actually do that over the summer and on sabbatical. You know, we work under such a frenzy of responsibilities. All of us are doing 90 things at once. And that's not conducive to the kind of intelligent reflection that develops when you're reading. And when you're writing, you need that intelligent reflection to produce the book. Just congratulations to all of you for doing what you did. And Matt, thanks for bringing up Where the Wild Things Are. I must have read that to my kids 100 times when they were, 5 or 6 years old. It's an absolutely wonderful book. And I've been in that world you're talking about for a long time. And it's a really intense process. Anyway, so just congratulations. That's all I wanted to say right now.
Well, then how about we wrap up on that congratulatory note? So congrats to all 4 of our speakers, and thank you all for coming out today. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your afternoon. It's always good to see you all. So thank you all, and we'll see you around. Bye-bye.